So I want to talk a little bit about some states that can arise as traps for seekers pursuing inquiry or surrender as the mind gets quieter and things get subtler. So these are some pretty basic ideas for the most part, but they're things to be aware of. Kind of going roughly in order from what I would call grosser, which is sort of from a less quiet mind to kind of subtler still. And so the first thing I'd say is if there's a feeling of a void or a sense of the I not existing or anything like that. Oh, I can't find the I. Or a blankness, any of these kinds of ideas. To notice that they are just ideas and that they occur to you and that we can't accept them at face value and the inquiry must continue. Or if it's surrender, the surrender must continue. That is to say, if it's surrender, the thought must be ignored and you must keep relaxing. If it's inquiry, then the question must be, to whom is this thought occurring? To whom is the thought of the blankness occurring? To whom is the thought of the void occurring? To whom is the thought that I can't find the I occurring? Or the I is nowhere occurring? To whom is any of those thoughts occurring? So that's one thing, blank void type ideas. Then there is the sense of the mind becoming quiet. The quietness of the mind cannot be taken again at face value because again the question arises, to whom is the quiet occurring? To whom is the quiet occurring? Or with surrender, again, to ignore the quiet and to relax. Because the quiet that you experience as quiet is accompanied by the subtle frame of reference that I'm experiencing the quiet. That subtle frame of reference is the underlying ego thought that we're trying to, in some sense, penetrate. So even when the mind is thought to be quiet, it's not actually absolutely quiet. There is an underlying whispered noise that's so relatively continuous, meaning subtle, not absolutely continuous because it's the ego. The ego comes and goes, actually, in some sense. But it seems very continuous, and so it seems like we've gotten so used to that particular hum that we don't notice it, and that seems like quiet to us, but it isn't complete quiet. And so the quiet that is experienced as quiet, you have to avoid allowing the mind to simply fall into that quiet. You have to pull the mind back from it and to notice it as quiet and inquire, to whom is this quiet occurring, or surrender, meaning ignore the quiet and relax. So the concentration has to be continued beyond the quiet. Then, deepening further, there are states of bliss. This is a sense of well-being and of peace. Here too, this is a good thing. These are all, in a way, good things because they're all deepenings of the surrender, the inquiry, but they're simply insufficient. So when you experience bliss, it is a coming and going bliss. Because you experience it as bliss, bliss that wasn't there before, now it's here. That bliss is an experience, a relative experience. It's accompanied by the ego thought, I'm experiencing this bliss. And so again, repeat the exercise. You either have to inquire into it, like who's experiencing this bliss, or surrender, meaning ignore the bliss and relax. So, covered blankness, void, and void type stuff. We've covered quietness, seeming quietness, relative quietness. Then bliss, experiences of bliss, or experiences of happiness, or experiences of peace, which are good things, again, but they're just not sufficient because we want the bliss that does not come and go, the bliss that is permanent. And that cannot be the bliss that's connected with the sense of being an individual. Then there are states of sleep. So literally when you go into profound inquiry or surrender, like when you go into any kind of deep concentration or meditation, there is the opportunity for you to fall asleep. Now, this can happen quite literally. You could literally feel sleepy and fall asleep. And it's not the worst thing in the world if you do, but if you can avoid falling into sleep, that would be best. If you can pull yourself back from there, notice that the sleepiness is itself a thought, that would be ideal. There's another kind of sleepiness, which is one step subtler, you might say, where you're not necessarily exactly physically falling asleep. That is, your body in some sense keeps going, but the mind seems to be deactivated for a moment, and or maybe several moments. And in that state, you were kind of absent. So the body was seemingly active, but the mind was absent. But there's a kind of dark tonality to this. So there is an effortlessness that's associated with it. But when I say a dark tonality, what I mean is there's an absence of clarity and light. So what is this? This is essentially right on the border between what you might say is sleep and, true breaking through, you might say, or the true natural state of being which we want. It's very, 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 very close. It is a kind of momentary true quieting of mind. It's what is termed, although I feel like this term has many layers and can be used in almost all the ways we've been talking about during this discussion. It's been termed laya in literature by Ramana Maharishi and others as like laya meaning rest. So the mind is absent during this state, and it is a kind of, you might argue it's a kind of samadhi. You might argue this is the space between thoughts. All of these things are true. And so it is very, very subtle and good thing. But the problem is that the basic sense that I am has still not been seen through. It's a temporary state, and though in many, many ways it's ideal because there's an effortless happening of the mind and the body, while in some sense, in some profound way, there's a kind of absence, So it is a kind of, you might argue, a total absorption, a samadhi, a real quietness of the mind, and a good thing. At the same time, it has some of the characteristics of deep sleep. Specifically, the bad characteristic of deep sleep, that the ignorance of the true self is preserved there. It isn't fully looked into. The mind kind of just spaces out, right? So this kind of idea of the mind spacing out, going absent, kind of mental fog sometimes, these could all be covered under this umbrella, where it's very, 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 very close to what we're looking for. Very, 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 very close. But one step further, it has to be taken one step further. It has to be viewed as, this kind of thing has to be viewed as a species of sleep. A species of sleep, a very particular species of sleep. It's very, very close to what we're looking for, but not exactly the same. It has to be, we have to pull ourselves back from even that and inquire into, who was it that experienced that absence? Or if you can see yourself going into that absence, right, to pull yourself back from that kind of absence, which is just a kind of darkening. It may not be possible all the time to pull yourself back from it, but we want a breakthrough into clarity. Light. We want light. And there must be, therefore, in what we're looking for, what I would call the spacious mind, which is sort of past that, this looking into who is it that is coming and going from these experiences, or surrender them all and relax. And what we're looking for is the clear, effortless, burden-lifting insight. It has the characteristics, all of these characteristics, in some ways. Quietness and bliss, effortlessness. But it's also got that characteristic of clarity and light, whereby it is known that what you thought you were is not what you are. So that's the spacious mind. That's a glimpse. Now, even there, you could legitimately say, who's experiencing that? But in the spacious mind, really, I guess, similar, in that sense, similar to what I called right before, that sort of darker samadhi, the spacious mind being kind of light samadhi, light-filled samadhi, which is what we want, as opposed to kind of more sleepy kind of samadhi, which is not as desirable. In both of those, you could argue that the question as to, well, what am I really, can't really arise, because the mind is actually, in some sense, profoundly stopped. But immediately afterwards, it would be wise to actually ask, even if one has had the spacious mind experience, which is what we're looking for, who went into it and who went into it and who came out of it. Because even that must break down. That, viewed that way, is an experience of the mind, because I came into it and I left it. And so, well, who came into it and who left it? That very question will probably provoke another spacious mind experience. In that spacious mind experience, we have the insight that I'm not entering it, and I never left it, and I can never leave it. So when that insight happens sufficiently, what happens is it breaks down the attachments, and eventually the entire structure of attachments breaks down. The spacious mind, which seemed like a kind of specific experience in time, reveals itself to be timeless and not an experience. So these are some subtle little traps to look out for as you pursue inquiry and surrender more deeply. Don't be drawn in by the lure of thinking that the quest is futile, or that there's a blank or a void. Don't be satisfied with mere quiet. Don't be satisfied with experiences of bliss all by themselves, insufficient, right? Don't succumb to literal physical sleepiness if you can avoid it. Don't be satisfied even with the sudden states of mental absence that can occur, which are very close to what we're looking for, because there the mind is absent and yet the mind is working. What we thought of as the mind was absent, and yet the mind and the body, in some sense, retrospectively, were working. They were doing things. So it wasn't physical sleep, but we weren't there. So that's samadhi. It's very, very close to what we're looking for, but the problem is it didn't have the element of insight or clarity associated with it. So we don't want to be satisfied with that. We want to inquire further into it. And then finally, there is the spacious mind, which is in some sense what we are looking for, which is the breakthrough into the recognition of what we actually are, and the recognition that we are not what we thought we were. And in both those latter two states, there really isn't any opportunity to ask any further questions technically in those states themselves, because those states don't really admit of any questions any more than you can ask when you're asleep, am I asleep? I mean, I guess you could do it when you're dreaming, but that, what I mean is deep sleep, dreamless sleep. But right after those states, you can inquire. And even with the spacious mind, which is what we are looking for, as soon as you seem to be out of it, you should re-inquire. So, so yeah, those last two states are very, very close, very similar, but we don't want to be satisfied with an absorption that is dark and lacking the sense of insight, the sense of um, transcending the usual I, but still being in some sense awake, not being simply and absolutely absent, because that would be a variety of sleep. This is waking sleep is what we're looking for, not merely yogically induced sleep. Right? There's physical sleep, which you can get by just like lying down. There's yogically induced sleep, which you can get by meditating very deeply and entering the sort of dark samadhi, which is lacking insight, but does have the quality of peace and effortlessness. And then there's the waking sleep, which is what we're looking for, which is the spacious mind, which is where uh, where I, in some profound sense, experience my own non-existence, as what I thought I was, and that being a profound experience of freedom, moksha, release, liberation, and that liberation being itself a timeless thing. And if one seems to exit it, then immediately we inquire.